is a very special episode of the Power Up podcast, and I am joined by two of the very best in leadership, mindset and behavioural change, and two friends that I've had the pleasure of working with for the last 25 years, obviously since I was about 5 years old. So Martin, welcome to your own podcast, and Jim, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm sure all of you recognise their faces and will definitely recognise their voices. But over the last some 3 decades, Martin and Jim have helped businesses across the world develop their leaders, drive change and release the potential of their teams. So today we thought it would be fantastic to get a bit of a reflection on those last 3 decades and look at some of the origins and influences of Martin and Jim's own careers and how they got into this line of work in the first place, how the landscape has changed. So we know a lot more now about neuroscience and psychology and how that has influenced the work that they do. And also we'll explore some of the most game-changing strategies that they have used to achieve transformations with themselves and their own clients. So whether you are a coach, a leader, or somebody that is just interested in all of this sort of stuff, I think it's going to be a very engaging and insightful episode.
Well, I hope so. Okay.
Over to you. Get inspiring.
What do you want to know? I mean, it's quite, when you're standing in front of audiences and they inevitably at some point might ask you, how long have you been doing this? And you tell them this is your 31st year of working with different leaders and audiences. It's quite a thing. It's quite a thing to, and actually, and I'm sure like you, Jim, thoroughly enjoying it. I think that is the most wonderful thing about what we do is we absolutely love what we do and we enjoy it. And still the thrill is still there in helping people go from point A to point B in our chosen subject. So.
And it is, it's the chosen subject. It's the interest in the content that's evolved that I'm interested in talking about. 30 years doing this, you're either a dinosaur or you're really wise, like you've worked some stuff out. I think we always talk about back in the day, does someone have 30 years experience, like what repeated over and over, or is it 30 years worth of experiencing things and learning from people who know a lot more, and building up your bank of ideas. And yes, it's equally fascinating now as it always was, for sure.
And so, I think that's a good place to start because you both had successful careers before you got into or alongside, this line of work. Where did it all begin and how did you end up taking this as a career path that 30 years ago, whenever it was?
Yeah, well, I suppose the first introduction to this line of thinking was a guy called W. Clement Stone. So before Martha and I got together in 94, I'd had 10 years working with a multinational. And the founder of that company was this guy, W. Clement Stone, the CEO of the company, the founder based in the US. And he was like one of the forefathers in positive thinking. Him and Napoleon Hill wrote some books together. And although it was difficult to connect with someone who was in his 80s at the time, I was sort of introduced to this concept that I suppose now we'd call a growth mindset. Whereas at the time, I just started thinking, what you mean you can become like kind of more than what you've been? Like I came out of school early, 16, worked in a garage for 4 years, pretty much failed as a mechanic, and then got into sales. And I don't know whether my belief systems and my identity, well, they certainly were fixed on who I thought I was. And coming out of school, even school where you learn those belief systems, a classic, I wasn't very academic, sporty, into art, bit of a fail-safe, right? And I had this belief system that I wasn't particularly clever, right? And I suppose I think nowadays, back in the day there weren't such things as ADD or dyslexia. I don't know whether I was in some sense. I know I was overwhelmed. I know if I had more than 2 things to think about, I couldn't focus. I couldn't read out loud in class. That might have been nerves, right? I remember my first parents' evening in the big school, and the teacher said, "I'm disgusted with James's performance in the English exam. I got a U, right? Unmarkable." ungradable. These were unclassified, right? I think you've got to get your name wrong to get a U. And he said, I'm disgusted. And my mother went, well, at least we know he didn't copy anyone, right? Which was like this. But it stuck with me. And I always felt that was who I was. So when I read this book on positive thinking, which was a bit basic, I suppose, nowadays, I just started having this thought, wow, well, what is that? What does thinking do? Why does that make a difference? And that was the start, I suppose, where I started to challenge my own limiting beliefs and make sense of it all. And then I was in the business where I was selling, managing, then training. So I started sharing these ideas that I just thought were like, life-changing, right? More personal development than professional, to be fair. But maybe that's the crossover we managed to, successfully navigate in the 90s. Right.
And I think that, the education system still now is a very fixed environment to achieve a growth mindset. And even I think Jamie Oliver was on the TV this morning, obviously he's dyslexic, and he was saying the same thing, there's loads of ideas in these brains, and there's not only one way of getting these things out there, i.e. academically writing something down. It's such an untapped resource of potential if you only measure people by a very narrow dimension like academic, achievements. So I'm glad you did challenge that.
Well, because you form a lot of your identity around your grades, around what you're told you are, right? From people that you believe, right? And, I'm sure it's with good intention because they're trying to motivate you to work harder, and you get this must try harder. I was trying hard.
Yeah.
I was just overwhelmed, right? For whatever reason. But getting into this content, and it's become more interesting as the years have gone on. And we'll get onto this around not just psychology, but neuroscience and things that you're like, wow, that makes sense,
Yeah. And for you, Martin, a similar sort of similar sort of story, isn't it?
By contrast, I was super bright and intelligent.
I mean, from a manual job.
No, actually, not. I completely relate to a lot of what Jim is talking about there. My memory of school was just, it was just sheer bloody gritty hard work. I was a sort of middle stream guy, sort of bubbling along the middle stream, but managed to sort of get my head above that middle stream by just working hard and, a bit of sort of dedication. And I probably driven out of fear. I was sort of a little bit of I wasn't particularly good at sport. And if you're not very good at sport, you're not going to be in the cool club, right? So I was quite cheeky. Impertinence was a key word that my teacher would constantly use. Impertinence of this child, and I found I could get people to laugh in the class by generally taking the mickey out of the teacher. And that, combined with trying to do a little bit better at my grades, got me a little bit of popularity. We were like you, Jim, fairly working class family, and actually were quite poor, to be quite frank with you. Mother used to sort of go to second-hand clothes shops, so we were never ever looking cool. Never had the coolest trainers. Never had the coolest football boots. Couldn't even kick a ball straight. I mean, even when we used to, the sort of my character building started standing in the playground, two self-selected captains would choose their football teams. I guarantee, that classic thing. I was always the last guy. All right, Martin, you come with us, but no one give the ball to him. It was that kind of thing, So I think it's driven by that. But one thing, having sort of left school, and my mum, was 4 kids. Dad died when I was quite young. My mum did get remarried, but her mentality was very working class. Get out, you're the eldest son, bring in some money. So I ended up, like you, Jim, doing an apprenticeship. And I did an apprenticeship in cabinet making. Went to college one day a week. And it was during that time that I got introduced to an American company called Amway, which is basically selling soap suds and, liquids and cleaning stuff. But it was a multi-level organization, American, and very whoopity-whoop. And it was a book, but I was like, not too distant from you, Think and Grow Rich, all right? And I was given this book, I started reading it, and it was the complete opposite. Nothing could be more different than what my mother was just like born negative. And so I started reading this book. Now, you can imagine I'm sitting in a workshop here with a bunch of guys reading the Sun newspaper, and I've got Think and Grow Rich. Well, you can imagine I was absolutely ridiculed for this. You can see these sort of oil stains down the side of it here, how warm it was.
It's lovely.
I'd actually fallen apart. Yeah, I mean, that was right. So I started reading this, and I thought, I remember the guy always saying to me, you know, what you talking about, you're reading a lot of rubbish. And I just thought, I'm not going to take advice from somebody who is 25 years my senior and earning like 5 pence more an hour than me and driving a rusty old Escort banger to work every day. So it was the start of thinking there's got to be something different. And it was an introduction to that, what, as Jim has described, positive thinking, which we know has its limitations. But it was the start of a very interesting journey. And eventually, like Jim, you know, what do you do? It's a classic thing, isn't it, Jim? You know, what do you do without a degree education? You wanted to better yourself. What's the easiest thing to do? But is actually you can get paid for being, you know, reasonably interpersonally bright and having a bit of tenacity. You go into sales. And I did the same. And then you start learning about yourself. You start learning. And the biggest challenge, of course, is sales, particularly when you're young, and is what goes on inside your head.
And in some sense, you change your environment, you know, either consciously or subconsciously, because there was no social media. There were no examples of people online, of people that succeeded or broke free into a new way of thinking that didn't have a degree, you know, and look, not that. But there just weren't any examples. So you get stuck in this fixed view that, well, that's going to be done then. Make the best of it, you know, a situation you're in, rather than really have a paradigm shift, you know, and start to see a whole new world out there, which is effectively, you know, over time what happened.
I remember that line that Robbins always used to use, Tony Robbins, which I found quite inspiring, where he used to say, I might not have a PhD, but I've got a PhD in results.
I love that.
And I thought to myself, that's I want to be that person. I'm going to use my results to speak for themselves, and that's exactly what we've both done.
And you both obviously went on a journey of personal development. What was the best investment that you made along that journey in terms of your own learning?
I tell you what, I think making the realization that you own your own development is an investment in itself, because that's a big. It's again coming off our last conversation that we're conditioned to believe we are what we've done. Let me go. You know what? I didn't get the development in school that others did for whatever reason, but that's not the end of the story. Realizing that was a big deal for me. And when I was in as a trainer, a sales trainer, you know, I came across this course. I was about 23, 24. I was just trying to think about, you know, can I get up and stand up and talk and speak to a group? I mean, I was wrestling with that dynamic. I saw the opportunity there, and I saw some of these American speakers in this company who were really good at it and thought, wow, that looks like quite the job, you know, but how do you get towards that? And I saw this course by Dale Carnegie, and Dale Carnegie had this speaking course, went on for months, and it was like 1,200 quid or something back in, this is like 1991. And I thought, where the hell am I going to get £1,200 from? And then I realized that, so my mum, right, in 1958, because I'm from Wales, she got Tom Jones's autograph. Her friend went to the States on holiday and came back with Elvis's autograph, and they swapped. And she'd given me Elvis's autograph some years before, right? And I had it in my drawer. I thought, I wonder what that's worth. I wonder if that's worth 1,200 quid. So I literally photocopied it and I sent it.
I've never heard this story.
I know. I photocopied it and I sent it to Christie's in London for evaluation, right? And anyway, before they replied to me, I spoke to my boss about what I was doing. I said, look, I'm going to go on this course. I don't know how. I didn't even think to ask the company to pay. I just thought, I'm going to do it. I don't know how, but here's what I've done. I've sent off this autograph. He said, how much is it? 1,200 quid. He said, book yourself on. I'll pay for it. Wow. And that was just like a life-changing moment. Right? And that was my entry point as now, I didn't invest in it. It was invested, but I was prepared to.
Yeah.
Point, right? And I did.
That's the key.
I accepted that. And we've had lots of those instances since then, whether it was Tony Robbins. So I introduced to Tony Robbins. I was still a trainer down in South Wales. And here's a guy I thought, look, this W. Clement Stone in his 80s, he's saying good things, but it's a bit 1920s. Like, is it really still relevant? Suddenly this guy, Tony Robbins, pops on the scene, who's like a little older than me, same age effectively. It's this I can buy into.
Yeah.
Tickets were 150 quid. I thought, well, and and even then that was a lot of money back then to me.
Yeah.
I found 150. I then heard he was doing a conference in Cannes called Date with Destiny. It was $3,000. I thought, how the hell am I going to get on that? Well, how I got on it, I ended up resigning from my 10-year career and joining Robbins Research so I could go on the thing in Cannes, which was a week after I joined. So it was that mindset of like, I want the development. I don't quite know how I'm going to get it, but it's for me to pursue it. That was the game changer.
That's so interesting, because you put your energy and your everything in that direction, and that personal development journey ended up being your passion and your
and a 30-year career. I mean,
amazing.
There's so many interesting parallels. I listened to you speaking there, but I had won a sales competition and a sales management competition. The prize was to go to the US. The first place was actually Dallas, San Francisco, and New York. Went to Dallas first because there was a guy called Zig Ziglar, who was an American speaker, very well known at the time, famous book called See You at the Top. And he was doing a really cheesy American course there called Born to Win. So I booked myself on this course. And like you, I'm standing this guy on the stage thinking, wow, that is a cool job. I'd love to be able to do that. Because I was doing a bit of sales training as you were. When I came back, I thought, okay, what's the gap between me, where I am today, and standing on that stage in front of 400 or 500 people, without a degree and all that inferiority thing that goes on, am I going to be bright enough and all the rest of it? And I was reading through the newspaper, Sunday Times, and I saw a little tiny ad that says, do you want to be a dynamic public speaker? I thought, yes, I do. Mike Fennessy, remember the guy's name, Mike Fennessy, national Toastmasters champion, public speaking lessons. Now, I'm in provincial Worthing here, and I probably don't leave Worthing more than once in my life at this point. That's ridiculous as it is. And I had to go to London. Now, London seemed like an age, like a big, big thing to go to London, a big, scary London. And I remember going up to London and meeting him, the Institute directors, you know how prestigious that is. And I literally would go up there like once every couple of weeks. I paid a ridiculous amount of money. I mean, it was 1983, 4 or something, 1,500 quid, which seems a ridiculous amount of money to have a one-on-one with this guy. But, join the dots backwards, as Steve Jobs would say. And that then led me on to something else. I then went to another program called by Georges Batunis, who was a speaker, trainer. So I started embarking myself on this sort of professional development and to get my confidence up. So it's a combination of these things that the more I did it, the more I said it to anyone, and you get this, Chip, right? You get people coming to us all the time saying 2 questions. Number 1, how do you get into this job? Right? We get that all the time. And 2, what would I need to do to get into it? And the first thing I say to them is, you need to go. You think you want to go and do it because it looks attractive. And you think, yeah, I'm pretty good, I could do it. But you need to go and find out. You need to go and do it. Then you'll know whether you want to do it or not. So go do that first. Go on some courses. Because if you get bored listening to the speakers and on the course, so you're not going to want to do it. Yeah. So as you said at the top of this, a really important point, you said it's the thirst for the knowledge, interest in the subject that keeps us driven. The speaking bit is the delivery of it, but it's the secondary bit. It's the actual, if your goal is to look good, sound good, and be on a stage and flap your arms around and be Mr. Popular, then sorry, no.
Well, I'd ask the question, are you a good delegate? Are you interested and enthused just watching people in that space, whatever it is, whether it's speaker or whatever the role is that you're focused on? When you look at people that are good at what you want to do, is that interesting? Right? Do you enjoy that process?
Yeah. So, and also, with everything that's changed over the last 30 years, if you were just doing it to look good on a stage, you would not be looking to stage any longer because so much has changed, and you have to stay ahead almost of that.
And it was sorry, just Lisa, it was one of your other questions that you prompted us with was about a bit of advice. And it just reminded me that the George Platunas, as speaker, I remember being on the course, and at some point, I don't know how we got onto the subject, but he sort of, not flippantly, didn't mean it, he doesn't mean this in a flippant way, and it's not meant to be, derogatory towards anybody. There's two things he said. Poor people should take rich people to lunch. Mm-hmm. And everyone was sort of looking around and go, what do you mean? He said, well, if you, it's not the other way around. They don't need to take, you should be taking them to lunch. It was kind of metaphoric. Go and learn from somebody who's already doing what you want to do. And the second bit of advice was find out what poor people are reading and don't read it. Yeah. And it was sort of, he was being a bit tongue in cheek about it, but those two things really stuck with me. Now, for me, he was like up there. So I thought, well, I'm going to call this guy out on this. So I called him up a couple of weeks later, and indeed I took him out to lunch. And he offered me a role. It was about a third of what I was earning in sales, so I turned him down. Right? But anyway, I did learn a lot from him, and I got a lot of confidence to pursue a career. And just for anyone listening to this, it's probably important to recognise here that as Jim ended up at Robbins Research, it was through a friend of mine, but I was also introduced a little time after Jim, probably 6 months after or so, to the same organisations, Robbins Research. And I'd been to the Unlimited Power weekend, seen Robbins, read the book, thought a bit like you, Jim. There's amazing parallels here. Yeah. Reading the book, thinking, hold on a minute, I had to reread it. This guy's what? Only like 2 years older than me. What? He's written a book already. He's on a stage. What am I doing? What am I doing? You've been talking about this for, it's not like this was something I thought about doing yesterday. I've been thinking about doing it for years. Mm-hmm. I was procrastinating, doubting myself. So yes, that was a catalyst. Joining Robbins Research, meeting Jim, and let's not forget our dear friend Colin, who joined around the same time. We've all worked together for 30 years. Everybody needs a catalyst for change, don't they? And when people ask about the Robbins events, I say, are they the best learning events in the world? Arguably not, but they are absolutely one of the best events for being a catalyst for change.
Yeah.
It propels you on to do something.
I was one of your early clients when you started Speakers International. So these young, cool-looking dudes came into Ernst & Young.
Still young-looking, cool dudes. Yeah, okay, right.
I didn't say that you didn't.
Yeah.
And I would say that you were the pioneers in exploring mindset and behavioural change in the corporate environment. In a world where development historically was about, how-tos and skills and that sort of thing. When you came into Ernst & Young, everybody that sat in one of your rooms was just blown away, because it was like the learning that you had in terms of it is possible to shift your mindset and shift your identity and change your behavior and change your results. I think you put a lot of people in those early days in control of their development, and still now, people talk about the courses that they went on in those early days, but it must have been daunting and difficult going into a corporate environment where there's loads of people with degrees and, they were very traditional in that sense. How did you, tackle that? And was it just deep breath, go for it? Or what things did you tackle with, and how did you overcome them?
Well, I felt that because I didn't know it was groundbreaking at the time, taking mindset and behavioral change and, what you can now for sure say was personal development, right? Yeah. Which is normally a little bit sort of West Coast, a little bit American-led. That was our experience. But I think we realized quite early on, well, that's not the way to deliver this, right? We're not in that market. We're not walking into a bunch of fans. So you've got to be mindful of the situation you're in. However, at the same time, and again, to your point, that these were potentially educated, so that could have been that limiting belief, but not on this topic they weren't.
No.
Right? On this topic, I always felt from a very early age when we set the business up, that I knew as much as anybody in this space. Right? And that's not necessarily true, but I believed it. I certainly thought I knew as much as anyone in the room. And I had the references of my own, inner journey that I'd been on, testing the content, testing the ideas, and I'd seen it land well in these big conferences. So I knew it was good content. Our challenge was, how do you frame it in such a way which deals with the skeptic in the room? Because that was the nature of the market. I don't doubt that it did blow people away, because the content's undeniable, right? The fundamentals of what we were talking about is the underpinning of performance, right? It's what drives behaviors, emotional state, things that when you start to put a spotlight on it, people go, that makes sense. You can't argue with the data, right? So it was for us just to believe in that, and seeing people like Martin and Colin, again, people our age, equally capable, equally passionate about it. Whereas I'd always thought professional speakers were in their 60s and had grey hair.
Yeah.
Now I was seeing a collection of people who weren't that demographic and were getting results with it. So, I quickly believed in the content to the extent that I knew at the end of the day, and I've just recently mentioned this to a client. I said, it's not how you start the session, it's how you end it. It's not how the session begins, right? It's what happens by the end of the session. And it's that process of taking a room from a skeptical standpoint, which is fair enough. And so you should be, to a certain extent. I would be. If you can move them from there to opening their mind, to engaging them in experience, and your style or your approach just happens to land, at the end of that session, if they're going, that was a good use of my time, and we became good at that. And the more references we got, the more I just knew walking into any room, by the end of the session, this was going to be fine. So there was no need for kind of any sort of unnecessary nervousness or apprehension. And that comes across when you walk in a room.
And looking back, I think it was a classic example of acting your way into a new way of thinking rather than thinking your way into a new way of acting. We built our references up very quickly by doing the doing, by going out and doing it. And it's that classic, how does a belief system get built? You go do, you get references. Oh, they like that. They liked it a lot. In fact, they absolutely loved it, as Lisa said. So it starts to build your confidence. Was I nervous? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did I have some doubts? Young, fresh face, no grey hairs, 33, 34, without the sort of, you're going into a room, largely probably 80% of people there have got, degrees. My question I never wanted anyone to ask me is, where'd you go to university? Please don't ask me that question. In fact, I even remember one lady being so surprised that she said, oh, okay, oh, really? Okay, so where did your mother go to university? Right. Well, nor did she. Oh, we're sort of running out of conversation. It's like a whole reference point. The success is you have to have this degree behind you.
And certainly in EY and many of the other companies that
as Jim said, what we very quickly learned, and I completely concur with this, is that we knew more about this subject than most people in the room. We were so well read. We'd been on our individual journeys. I'd been on all sorts of crazy personal development courses. And suddenly I realized I was way more of an expert than most of the people in the room. And in fact, actually, when I even followed, I remember one gig I was doing, I was following this psychologist. I'm thinking, oh no, it's the last thing I want, following a psychologist. The psychologist goes in, does his thing, boring as hell. I mean, absolutely. I was bored and I'm supposed to be interested. You could see the audience were bored. I go in and I go after this individual, super practical, few funny stories, etc., and they're all lit up. So this is what I mean about this sort of acting your way into a new way of thinking and building these references.
Yeah.
Suddenly realizing, actually, we have real expertise in this area. And the audience absolutely loved it. I mean, do you remember that classic pitch we did in the very early stages when we would simply ask people, why are your best people the best? And they would tell you all these reasons they were the best. And they would typically be 80% mindset and 20% skill. Well, you'd simply ask them the question, how much of your training budget and time and resources are you spending on mindset versus skill? And virtually mindset was zero.
Yeah,
that's right.
Here we are with this amazing package on developing mindset. So, yeah, That was our pitch, and it worked extremely well. Things have been good since, and let me say, things have got more sophisticated.
No question.
30 years ago, Jim, you remember that.
And I think
very, very early stages.
I think it was a combination of, you did know your stuff more than everyone else, but it was the way in which you delivered it. You weren't the psychologist on the stage boring as hell. It was extremely enjoyable, you learn more when you have fun, extremely practical and very emotional. People connected with the content emotionally. It wasn't about learning how to deliver more effective interviews. It was how to be a better version of yourself. Which
that was also a happy coincidence with the collection of people that were gathering around us. We were we were into the motivational stuff. That wasn't going to land well with most audiences we were in. So that wasn't going to, that wasn't. Then we started getting into NLP, the sort of popular psychology of the day. Yeah. That was fascinating to us. Like, the content, not that we talked about it that much, but in terms of helping us develop ourselves, because we didn't stop developing ourselves during this process. And then we got involved with a couple of guys, the Templetons, who were in the educational space. And these guys were just phenomenal, right? And huge influence on my life for sure. Their style, it was their energy. They had this sort of ability of navigating chaos. They were artistic as well as scientific, But they introduced us to accelerated learning, new concept. Right, it's accelerated learning. What's that? And it's all about the practicalities of engaging the listener, taking them on a journey, using stories. So we use this phrase now on a program that you run around Extraordinary Leader. Building around the competency. We were developing ourselves around the competency. We weren't trying to be good speakers. I certainly wasn't. Developing around the competency that all lent itself to being pretty good and proficient in this space where we were operating.
And you are the sum of the average of the 5 people surrounding you or whatever. You absolutely surrounded yourself with.
It was fortuitous. Well, the mission we were on attracted a certain type of person, and if you weren't on that mission, you'd get spat out, right? Yeah. And if you were bringing something to the table, and we were very thirsty and hungry for ideas and information. And if you had an idea that worked, we'd test it, right? And we'd use it. We weren't precious going, this is just our stuff, right? We were creating, new ways of communicating the content that we were so interested in.
And you mentioned that, the 80-20 thing, and 20%, if at all, being around skills, but at least 80% of the training budget being focused on skills. How has that conversation now changed? There's a lot more of awareness and a lot more we know about neuroscience. How has that conversation with clients changed around the mindset and behavioral change?
I would say that, as I said earlier, it's not more sophisticated now. If you went back 20, 30 years and you started talking to people about coaching, or you've got a coach, you would basically looked at, there's something wrong with you. Here we are, 2025, you don't have a coach, there's something wrong with you. But the challenge for us is that everybody is a lot more educated. Everybody knows a lot about these things. They were very relatively new at the time. This was a domain of professors and psychologists, and it was all kept away, and you could have access to this stuff, and suddenly became more and more accessible to learn. So you've got a much more, every client I have a conversation with now about the development of their people, they're bright, they're sharp, they're across these things. Sometimes they know even more. Yeah. Sometimes they might know something different. It's actually far more enjoyable in a way.
Yeah, totally.
I had a conversation with someone in the last week, and it was just so invigorating to have a conversation with somebody who knows about these things and actually can hear what you're saying, rather than perhaps back then it was like, oh, really? I need a bit more convincing. Now they've got their own ideas, and so you can design something that is absolutely fit for purpose, rather than sort of a sheep dip. Yep. Yeah. We can design things that are absolutely specifically to change the behavior they're looking to change. So I think it's intellectually more stimulating. Maybe it's the level we're operating at now, Jim. I'm probably operating at a much, much higher level. Yeah. We know we're working at the most senior level now.
I think it's also now less about content and it's more about application of content.
Mm.
But people know stuff, right?
Yes.
You get everything you need. If I give you the right prompt on ChatGPT, you can get all the content you need with a plan, a strategy, a set of disciplines. There's a lot of content out there. But again, I think where we have an edge is we focus on taking that content into a behavioral pattern that makes a result that, moves you in a direction, helps you kind of get a little more control over the way you're responding to things or engaging with your teams. I think go back when you say, what's changed over the 30 years. I mean, back in the 90s, like burnout was a badge of honor, right? You first sussed out, right? It was seen as almost like a competence, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Whereas, and that leadership by command and control was the go-to. Whereas the shift that I've seen around this kind of content with understanding things like emotional intelligence, growth mindset, I think leaders have without a doubt have embraced and become more knowledgeable on some of these elements of empowerment rather than just being directive. And the reason is because it works, right? Because it gets better results. So they are more well-informed, and it is a much more interesting conversation. And I think they're still hungry for application rather than just understanding.
I would say I was speaking to a client the other day, and I was saying, look, the content is I'm not really care about it. You can have the content. I can send you can read it all. You can send you the slides if you want. It's not going to get you a result. What's going to get you a result is the implementation of that specific to your particular situation. And that is where our skill is. Yeah. We have a very, very high ability to be able to know what somebody actually needs and to be able to curate a solution for somebody and then show them how to implement that solution over a period of time. And that's our secret sauce, to be able to get the shift they want. And anyone, as you say, anyone can read the book. Here's a book, here's a podcast, plethora of information out there. In fact, it's too much almost.
I think so.
Too many people talking about something they don't know that much about, they learn a little bit about. So when it really comes down to it, and an organization wants to, 10,000 people wants to start thinking and acting and behaving in a slightly different way, standing on a stage and spouting out a few, pump them up and glaze them over phrases is not going to get a result. But we do know what it takes to get that change. And therefore, we're very robust in challenging clients in what needs to happen to get that change.
And also how to engage that community to want to take it on board, right? Yeah. So we do, yes, we'll do training. Yes, we'll speak at a conference. And maybe that's the conference space is where you're there just to get the room to go, what have we got?
It's one part of a solution, isn't it?
It's an eye-opener. It's a little bit of a shift of 2 degrees onto a different direction. And creating an interest to go on a different journey, which then will work with you to try and facilitate that too. But I think we can gain interest and gain people's interest in something and give them a little bit of belief that there's something worthwhile in this pursuit.
Yeah. And I think that, the developments in neuroscience and, what we now know about human behavior and how the brain works and how we can adapt and change really helps us fine tune that approach. And I know, Jim, obviously you've written an amazing and very highly practical book, Unashamedly Superhuman. But what, in writing that book and in the work that you do and what you've learned about neuroscience and behavioral psychology, both of you, what are the most significant things that you have discovered that you now apply in what you do?
Again, look, we got into the content back in the day that psychologists knew a lot more about. We got good at processing that content and being a conduit between that content and the room. Right. Same with psychology, same with neuroscience. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm an enthusiast. I'm a participant, and I'll go and do the 100 hours of podcast to find 5 minutes of content that I think people will be able to use. But I've gained through this last 2 or 3 years for sure is a deeper understanding that, high performance isn't just about innate talent. right? It is about unlocking systems, processes, parts of our thinking, parts of our mind, our nervous system, without going too deep into the weeds, that you genuinely start to understand these cliches about how to tap potential, which has been bandied about forever. But suddenly with some of these studies that will avail to everybody, you start to find strategies and hacks and ways to genuinely change the way you process information, change the way you respond under pressure. And I think, fundamentally, it always has, and maybe still boils down to one central point, whatever the challenges are, whether it's the speed of change, adapting to Gen I, whether it's market conditions, whatever the challenge of the day is, it always, in my mind anyway, filters back down to the state of mind that somebody's in any given situation. If they have more control over that, they're going to lean in differently. They'll have that difficult conversation. They'll stand up and ask that tough question. They'll approach the client with a new idea. All the things we need to do, the behaviors, still fundamentally will come from having control over the state of mind you're in the moment. And what the neuroscience community has got very good at is making that information accessible and data-led, right? It's not just anecdotal. It's not that different to 30 years ago in some sense, right? And it really can reconfirm, and I've heard you talk about this, that we were on the right track without even knowing it, right? But it's given us a lot more leverage to go, this is worth thinking about and talking about and pursuing. Yeah.
I think it's spot on. If I think about what we were saying 30 years ago and what we're saying, what we're inferring today, they're exactly the same. The big difference is we were making claims about things before, for which we intuitively knew were right. We had our own experience of applying those things. Today, we have the science to prove it to be correct. That is the single biggest difference. So in most of the work we do, and I would say that is the biggest single shift. You start with science, you start with data, because we know educated people. And as we said, we've got a more sophisticated, discerning audience. They're more skeptical. They want to know if they're going to invest money, is it actually going to work? By providing the science and the data, I think what we're very good at doing is taking that science and data and packaging it into something that makes the science more accessible. So giving it a label, giving it a model, giving it something to say, this is what this science means. We call it this. Then the final bit is the most important bit, is how are you going to apply it? How does that science fit this model? How does that model fit with what you're doing today? And if you can do that, and you can do that almost instantaneously, that's very important. Otherwise, people go with that classic thing where people leave a day. What do you think of the speech? What do you think of the day? Oh, it's really interesting. Because it is sexy. Learning about the mind, learning something. Oh, did this little exercise. You're going to do this head spin. Oh, that was really cool. And we closed our eyes. We did, come up with this little phrase and story. That's great. Fantastic. Well done. Brilliant. But how you actually will apply it, and how can we get the person, even more importantly, to apply it the day after that and the day after that. In fact, keep doing it consistently until they get a result.
Yeah, well, I think that's I agree, and that's what's been really interesting with this body of work, is that we're unlocking these built-in systems that everyone has. It's not like some people have them. We've got the same nervous system, right? And when we get a little bit more insight into how do I pull the levers or flick the switch to get the result, it's a bit like the conversation around flow states, which I really got interested in. And I got interested in them because it was right in a period 2 or 3 years ago when the world had turned upside down. Well, I tell you, if I needed one thing, I needed flow. I needed to know how to get in the zone, right? Because I wasn't in the zone. It was difficult. But even that was fortuitous, because I had to really think about, this isn't just interesting to me. This has to be practical and user-friendly. And to kind of create the reveal that we've all been in the zone. We've all been dialed in. We've all lost track of time. We've all become super productive. We've all experienced it. But if you want it next Tuesday at 3:00, what are you going to do that? How do I control that so I can influence my nervous system to trip into the flow states when I need them? That was, again, how to do that. So, The science gives you that information. But then you've got to make it practical again, as Martin said, right? Then you've got to, you've got to go, well, how do you do it? Well, there's the Pomodoro effect. This is where you block out all distraction. You put in a block of time for your deep work. Your phone's off, the door's locked. They take care of the part of the brain which needs to immerse yourself into this situation. Very clear outcome. You know exactly what you're trying to achieve. If you tick these boxes, you're going to trip your brain into a system where you've got dopamine in your system, a little bit of endorphins, some serotonin. You'll get a chemistry shift in your nervous system because we're going to tell you do these things and then see what happens. Not just saying it's good being in the zone. Well, everyone knows that. Well, yeah, what's the process, to your point, that you can go and do tomorrow, and tomorrow you're going to go, that was incredible. That just worked.
See, what you're describing there, Jim, is the difference between saying to somebody, your point earlier around, and I'm with you on this, is state drives everything. Perhaps before we would be saying to people, you need to get yourself into a better state. Come on, feel good. Get yourself. Now what we're doing, as you're just describing there, these are all the different, this is what the science tells us about when somebody is in a peak state, when they are in a flow state, these are the ways in which you can get there, and you can get there really quickly. I think you actually inspired me to read this book. I think it was you that read this. I got onto it. You then went and did a program with Stephen Kotler, didn't you?
Yeah.
Learn more about flow state. That was led you on to other things. That whole thing around sort of shutting down the prefrontal lobes and how when you're in that sort of flow state, that critical voice turns off, and you're relying on a much more intuitive part of you. And how somebody on a surfboard making the tiny micro movements, how do they know to do that to stay alive in that new circumstance and a back barrel wave? It's very much because that critical voice has gone down, prefrontal lobes have closed down. Is it called hyperfrontality or something like that? You know the names of these.
Yeah, well, but not only is it that, but also it reframes the value of the challenge, because you need a challenge to get into flow, right? If I give an example, if you're riding a bicycle across an open field, you're not in the zone. You can be relaxed, you can be perfectly capable in doing what you're doing, but your brain doesn't trigger adrenaline. It doesn't trigger more dopamine or anandamide, this sort of pattern recognition chemical. But if you're suddenly riding down a single track down the side of a mountain on your mountain bike, and the brain, as long as it's not too big a challenge for your skill set, because if the balance is right between your skill and your challenge, the brain responds, and this is what's exciting. You consciously provoke it. You're built to respond if you get the environment right around you. And we're just saying, how do you control the environment so that your reaction is that you get this chemistry change in your brain and your body, you just feel more alive, more alert, more focused, calmer, and then you get the back end. That's the payoff, right?
But that's interesting, isn't it? Because there lies the catch. Because what you're saying is you need to put yourself in a more demanding situation. But the existing belief system we've got is, I don't want to put myself in a situation I might not be able to handle, which means me going outside my comfort zone. But can you see, it's going outside the comfort zone,
leaning into it,
that gives you the realization you can do it, that actually, as you're saying there, that the brain actually starts to take over.
That's right.
It gives you, I mean, it's a bit like, I don't know, I always liken it to being in a meeting with a client. You're in it. You're not even given time to think about it. Your adrenaline's pumping. You want to make a positive impression. The client asks you a question that you've never been asked before. And somehow from somewhere, it's the most amazing answer starts to come out of your mouth. Yeah. And inside your head, you're thinking, no, I knew I was good, but I realized I was not good. I'm impressed with myself as I'm speaking. I'd almost wish I'd have recorded to record what I've just said, because it seems so good. Now, is that because I'm just in a sleepy, easy meeting? No. Because I'm in a difficult meeting.
But it's a bit like the analogy I often give with if you're a skier. If I'm a novice, which I've never skied, so I'm a novice. You'd say you need to go down this particular run. Is it the green run? I don't know what this is. Right? There's a color code for me. Right? If I went down a black run, that's challenging, but it's way too challenging. and I'll get spat off the mountain I had no right being on. That's not flow, right?
Yeah.
But if you're an expert skier and you go down the green run, that's not going to trigger flow. Now, it's getting the balance right, and it doesn't mean it doesn't mean we have to be super challenged all the time. You can be sat in your office with a bit of deep work to do that's a bit more cognitive. It's not physical, right? But you've set the challenge, you've set the goal. I give myself a timeline. You've created a little dynamic tension, right? So it doesn't mean that it's not overwhelming. It's just it's right on the line.
Not easy, not too hard somewhere.
Challenging enough to recruit. The reaction that you're looking for. It's like, what goal? How big should your goal be? Well, the goal should be not too big that it keeps you up at night, but big enough that it gets you up in the morning. Right? It's getting that little bit of forethought about what am I trying to do in this situation.
Yeah.
This is what I think the difference between people who say they work hard. Now, working hard at something that is relatively easy doesn't move you forward. So if you're just working hard, as in I'm working a lot, that's not as going to advance you as much as actually doing something which is actually hard to do.
Right, yeah, good point.
Is the big difference. And when you do something that's hard to do, then suddenly it's a game changer. You learn the most about yourself and the world around you. You make new distinctions, you new discoveries, because you're pushing the boundaries. That's how science progresses. It's pushing the boundaries of your own possibility in a much more meaningful, constructive way, and then learning from that and applying it. That's what we're really encouraging people to do.
And leaders, we're encouraging leaders to challenge their team, challenge them to push them out onto the edge, but prepare them first, to develop them, prepare them, and then challenge them. And it's that sort of that model of thinking that prepare, develop, challenge, and keep moving forward, right?
And so translating this into some of the work that you've done with leaders and with clients, using that sort of theory, what are the sort of most powerful transformations that you have seen in clients that you've worked with?
I think the most impact that I've seen is when you enable the culture, or you're working with the leadership team to work with their culture, to start to get more alignment on and there's nothing new in the concept, but more alignment around the why, the what, and the how, right? This vision within the team. Now, I know that's obvious, but I mean really showing them how to create a red thread from each individual up to the purpose of the business, right? Everyone's got a purpose statement. And I often say to teams, if I phoned any one of your team up at 3 a.m. and said, what's the vision statement? What's the purpose? Would they know? And the answer obviously is oftentimes not. Even if they did, that doesn't mean they're connected to it, right? So, we're working with the team to really get again, this red thread up from everyone in an organization up to this feeling of why we're doing what we're doing, clarity around the what it looks like when we do, and their part in the how to. And, it's not rocket science, but when you get that alignment, you see forward motion. Now, there's a lot more to what people need to develop in order to do the how to, right? But at least the how tos are moving in a direction where there's alignment, there's agreement, and there's some sense of intrinsic motivation. I have autonomy in my role. I'm focused on the purpose. And then there's the third element of intrinsic motivation around mastery. Control the controllables. Now, once the goal's set, once we're clear on the direction, take your mind off the direction, right? It's like I listened to Chris Hoy talking recently, and it's quite moving because obviously he's going through a lot right now. But he was talking about, I interviewed him as well a few years ago, him and Dave Brailsford, and he talked then about this concept of focus on the pedals, not the podium. Once you've decided what the podium is, that's my outcome. That's what I'm trying. Of course, he wants to win gold. But once there's clarity around that, then the focus is, what's the pedal? What do I need to be focused on? The controllables that I can do. You hear sports talk about performance over results every time. If a team loses, they talk about the performance. If a team wins, they talk about the performance because that's a bit they can control. So seeing cultures and teams that set that direction, there's alignment, and then they focus on the pedals on the podium, I've seen that be transformational.
To that end, I would say that I think the realization is that motivation itself is fairly unreliable. So if you're relying on your own personal motivation, and that, we all have goals and we would say we want to go for it. But if, you could have a town hall day and everyone gets excited about the vision. But that town hall is like a bit like taking a warm bath. It's going to feel good for a while.
Yeah.
If the environment they go back into is not supporting that change,
that's good.
You're not hearing the same thing from other leaders. You're not being rewarded for what the change is about. There's no incentive for you to do it. And when you do it, it doesn't get acknowledged. What's the social impact? If you're all motivated to, if I'm in a group of friends and I want to get super fit and I want to lose weight, but most of my friends are, binge drink and are lard asses, probably being rude about that. They're likely to win, if that's my environment. So in the same way in an organization, if I go back, most of the team are fairly negative about the change. That is just, as our friend Colin says, it's a maths problem.
Yeah.
Right? The forces of influence, of which there are many, if you're purely relying on someone's personal motivation, and actually if you start the purpose up and you've told them why we need to do it, and everyone's largely bought into it, these other forces of influence, this is the thing I think we're really focusing on now.
Yeah, starting to
and you call it yourself a holistic performance lab. We would take this holistic approach and say you can't just look at one element to initiate that change, because it's very, very unreliable. It's a bit of a band-aid, isn't it? Just saying on a course, or let's get people thinking away. And almost the old L&D mentality was, I've done my job.
Yeah.
Put people on a training course. I've taught them how to negotiate, sell better, work as a team. We did a high-performance team session. Yeah, but if you go back into the workplace and everyone's rewarding individual behavior,
right.
It's like having a pear tree in the garden expecting apples. It's that lovely exercise that our friend Colin does. He says, gets everyone to draw a tree, and everyone draws a tree. Very, very few people draw the roots. And so what we're saying is it's the roots that we need to pay attention to. Yeah. And I think that's probably where we've moved on, is to say, we know we want people to think and act in a different way, but what are the other forces at play that are actually preventing it from happening?
And I think that what Jim was saying in terms of focus on the pedals, that fits with the
exactly
one we're looking at as well, isn't it? So define the goal, think of the specific behaviours that everybody needs to perform in the moments that matter, and align the environment to support that.
Sorry, go on, you go for it.
No, I was going to say, it's like thinking that analogy, the pedals build the culture, right? Yeah. What do we do in day to day, and how we communicate with each other, how we give feedback to each other, right? How we collaborate, how we work and break down silos. These are the things we can do. In fact, most of those things, they don't cost money. And most of those things, actually, I had this great question the other day, can you be the best? Can you be the best at the world of the things that don't take skill? Focus on being the best in the world of things that don't take skill, right? There's so many things like following through on your promises, to do something, doing it, Doesn't take any skill. So I think of all the things you do, what are those things that don't require me to be good at something, but if I do those at a world-class level, that's going to make a difference.
I'm switching on to people that I don't think people are deliberately, they're not coming to work against the vision. They're not working against the purpose. It's not their intention to do that. But leaders so commonly attribute blame to their people. Our people are thinking on the right way. You need to go and change their thinking. I think they actually want to think more positively. They want to actually do a better job, but it's the environment they're in, how they're being rewarded, the processes, the systems, the way you organize your meetings, the way somebody is being spoken to. That is what antagonizes people and causes people to turn off from the direction you want them to go. So what we're attempting to do is to actually go in and try and analyze and work out where those behaviors are. What are the behaviors that you are inadvertently doing? It's like child, we've all raised children. We can say things to our kids when they were younger and realize, okay, that's got the wrong result. But actually, you created the result. Now we're blaming the kid for doing something we got them to do.
Yeah.
Right? But it's recognized that in a leadership sense, that we are actually creating the behaviors through our own blindness to what we're doing.
Yeah. I think this is where you see things like, some of them, again, are sort of the I say newer terms. Psychological safety is a new one. Stuff that Brené Brown talks about around vulnerability.
Yeah.
Some of these things that not easy to talk about, not so easy to do, because we're not necessarily look. It's a tough role, the leadership role. Managing is a tough role. And there are expectations, there's pressure, there are results. We're in business, right? There's targets. There's a lot of these metrics that have nothing to do with psychological safety or vulnerability. In fact, I haven't got time for that. I've got a job to do. So I respect that challenge, but it's almost like if the focus is just on the result and not on your inner capability. Control yourself under pressure, the emotional intelligence that you bring to the communication. Because that's not on my goals and targets list. Right? I'm not being rewarded for that. Well, you are when you make that distinction. Actually, you are being rewarded for it, because if you can really get your head around some of these psychological elements of performance, the performance goes up. There's so much data to back that up. So even though it's like it may be a little longer term because it takes a shift in how you approach situations and people, but developing those inner capabilities so you can lean in a much more resourceful way, is showing how you want your teams to be. It will hit the number, right? The things that you think you're there to do.
It's like the balance, isn't it, between kindness and accountability. You actually need elements of both of those things. One with the other is not going to achieve the result.
I sort of think about it as you spiraling up or spiraling down. I remember, my personal experience in my relationship with Fiona. Before we got married, and we were going through a bit of a tough time. We were, behaving in a certain way that was, you could describe it as a low performance, right? Low performance relationship. It was spiraling down. She would do a thing, it would annoy me. I would then retaliate to that inadvertently, not even particularly being consciously of it. We just got slightly irritated. And you got to a point where you think, this is just over, this is finished. So we go to this therapist, and she says, we go to her to say, look, we've been together 7 years, but we think we're done. We could do with some help in trying to, depart amicably. And the first thing she said was, that we really want to do. I mean, the fact have you ever been great? Yes. How long were you great for? A long time. Right. So you know how to do it. So you had a set of behaviors that produce a set of results. Suddenly you find yourself with a different result. Might I suggest you're producing a different set of behaviors? Right? Not consciously. You're not doing it deliberately. You don't want what you've got. Do you want something different? Do you want what you had before? Okay, yeah, we do actually. So, and we went on this kind of program of work. And the way I describe it is that gradually, bit by bit, we started doing something slightly different. So she does something different, I respond to it differently. She sees me respond more positively, and it's like almost like a flower that is closed is now suddenly blossoming and opening up, and getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah,
and it was a really magical. Honestly, it's a very personal experience, and we did end up, getting married. And I think about what happens in organizations.
Yeah.
It's that classic thing, isn't it? One of my favorite books, The Power of Kabbalah. In there, the author talks about the suddenly syndrome, and how he says that, you don't wake up in the morning, with an oak tree on your front garden. That's been growing a long time. And when he would say, relationships suddenly broke up, I suddenly got the sack, no, nothing happened suddenly. You've been doing it unconsciously for a long period of time. What we're trying to do is switch on and say, hold on, you can over time change that dramatically. I mean, dramatically. How many times you get asked this question, Jim? Can people really change?
Yeah.
Can people really change? My answer is absolutely concrete. Yes, they can, provided you provide all these conditions.
Yeah.
Not motivation on its own, but a number of factors all together. Then yes, absolutely.
And I think that's really exciting about the body of work we're starting to develop now, is like the way to make that change inevitable. That's how we describe it, isn't it? By paying attention to these forces. So we have covered a whole lot of ground in terms of the evolution, where it started, the evolution of the work that you're doing and the impact that is having on leaders and some of the strategies leaders can use. But I want to finish with a few little quick fire questions that I dreamed up to just, dig a little bit deeper in terms of your own journey. So if you had to sum up your own personal biggest lessons from the last 30 years, what would they be?
I don't know. I think if I was to, okay, that's a big question. I would say simply there's more to us than meets the eye. That's been my overriding belief system that's been reinforced over and over again. And all the research we do, all our interests have changed over the years, but it keeps revealing that there's more to us than meets the eye. And there's that Lewis Carroll quote that I kind of changed it. I shouldn't really change Lewis Carroll's quote, should you?
Sure, I won't mind.
Sorry, Lewis, but I think I've got a better version. He talked about, he says, you're braver than you believe. I changed that because obviously the 3 sections of the book were better, smarter, stronger. But it's pretty much the same sentence, that you're better than you believe, smarter than you think, and stronger than you seem. And I think that's true. And there's good evidence of people's experiences on reflection, maybe not when you're in the thick of it, but on reflection that will back that up. So I think my overriding biggest lesson is there's more to us than meets the eye.
Yeah,
I support that. I sort of think about it like this, that I think my biggest message to anybody listening, to anybody embarking on their own life and wanting to improve things, it's just the full recognition that over time you pretty much get what you deserve. You cannot look beyond yourself for the results that you produce. Yeah, look, there are a tiny percentage of people and who are extremely unlucky, disease or whatever, all right? But for the bulk of people, if we look at our lives, they're perfectly aligned for the results you produced, whether that is in your relationships, your health, your career, money, financial success, feeling of self-worth, how much you like yourself, how much you like other people. It's a sum total of how you've been living your life.
Yeah.
And that to me it sits at the heart of what gives me the belief that anybody can create a new life and they can create change for themselves. It's that classic thing, what you put in is what you ultimately will get out. So anybody who achieves great success in their life, I'm never in awe of it, but I respect it, and I think they deserve everything they get, because I think when we talk about luck, I absolutely believe we create our own luck. You get what you deserve.
Yeah.
In fact, it's one of the most profound things that when I go back all those years and go back to this book, Think and Grow Rich, he talks about in there was that he says that everything you're doing in your life right now, as you're trying to build your success, is totally out of proportion to the results you're producing. So you're working really hard, but actually getting a relatively small result as you're trying to make yourself successful. When you're successful, the results you're producing will be totally out of proportion to the services you're rendering. And I thought, that's really interesting, isn't it? And it's absolutely come to be true. But what do we do when we see those people going, oh, look at them, they're hardly doing anything, and yet they're getting this? Guess what? They deserve it. Now, whether that is a really healthy relationship, well, it's all very well for you, you get on really well. Well, that didn't happen by chance. You've got a great relationship with your kids. That didn't happen by chance. You've got a healthy body. That didn't happen by chance. You've got a successful career. It doesn't happen by chance. So this gives me the absolute belief that with putting something different in, gradually, over time, we can dramatically change our lives. Happier, healthier, wiser, what do you call it? Bigger, bolder, stronger.
Better, smarter, stronger.
There you go. So there you go. So
He's changing yours now. You changed Lewis, he's changing yours.
Yeah. I know, that's what he was really trying to say, actually. You've just improved. You've helped me think better. Yeah.
And so in terms of, going back to the 30-odd-year-old selves that started this journey all those years ago, what advice would you give your younger self Is it in line with that or something different?
Do you know if I could again, it's a great question, isn't it, to reflect the 2020 vision and all that. And I don't know how I could have done it, but the advice I would give would be don't worry too much about other people's opinions of you. Right. So, if FOMO is fear of missing out,
I need to do that more.
FOPO is fear of other people's opinions. And look, to a certain sense, we do, and we're mindful because it's relevant. I'm trying to create a result. I want the result to go well. I want them to believe it was worth their investment of my time, and their investment in bringing you in. So of course I have an interest in people's opinions, but that's very different to worry about what people think. And I think I've always been just a bit overthinker, a bit of a worrier. I get a bit distracted, a bit overwhelmed, like I mentioned before. So I have to have strategies to try and manage that, like a lot of people do. There's nothing new in this, but that's a big one. I think that can eat away at you.
That's really interesting. The one I actually wrote down here, my first sentence was worry less about needing to prove myself. Very, very similar.
Yeah.
And I do think we all question our own abilities and ourselves, and therefore we go out to great lengths to try and, get acknowledged, get approved, be accepted. It's a normal human behavior to do. But actually, when we think about it, it's actually quite an arrogant, selfish act.
Yeah.
Because I don't think anyone really is thinking about us.
Yeah, it's like actually, when I'm working with somebody and somebody is going this route, I said, look, by the way, people aren't that interested in you being great. I wouldn't really worry about it. I know you're thinking you need to be great, but don't put that focus on yourself. I'll tell you what, how about taking the focus off yourself and focus on the value you're adding to other people?
Yeah.
You're brilliant at what you do. Go do more of it. So for me, it's about focusing less on myself, but relying and focusing on the power of the message and the knowledge that I'm transferring.
Yeah.
Let the knowledge do the work. I happen to be, I believe, a good communicator. I'm put on this earth to communicate ideas to people. My ideas are centered, but not necessarily mine. They're a combination of old ideas and new ideas and study. But my job, my life purpose is to be a transporter of those ideas to other people. And so it's not about me. Take the focus off myself and just put it on the act of service of giving someone an idea. I don't need to put my judgment on whether they like me and the way I'm doing it is an ego-driven thing.
Yeah.
So get past the ego. When you drop the ego, it allows you to move forward. It allows you to go do the job you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, fantastic. Love both of those. So I think we've got time for one more question. And the one I shall pick is, you're on a desert island, what book or podcast? I mean, podcast is a bit of a cheat, isn't it? Because you're getting a series. So I think what book, or if there is one podcast episode, apart from this one, obviously.
Yeah, apart from my book.
Yeah. I'm trying to get to be human without any question.
Brainer.
You're already packed.
Okay. I was never in the Boy Scouts, so I'd probably have to get a book by Ray Mears on bushcraft, because I put it on fire, right? But if I take the practicalities out of sitting on a desert island, there's a couple of books that and there's a bit of a theme, and it wasn't that I thought that these books had to align. One of the first books that I started recommending people read many years ago was by Dan Millman, called The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. And the reason I recommended it was because it's a simple story-based book about a young athlete who kind of he connects with this guy who's the petrol pump attendant, but he called him Socrates because he was so insightful, and he teaches him life lessons. And it's just a lovely read. It's a narrative, and it's really all about, effectively, being able to stay in the moment. Or it kind of goes a bit back to the last answer, I suppose, about worrying about other people's opinions. What are you doing then when you're not in the moment? To your point, Martin, if you're in the moment, you're focused on what you're doing and the value you're producing. And there's a follow-up book that was written by Tolle Eckhart, The Power of Now, which is, again, a similar theme that I think it's something that I daily have to consciously decide. through some meditation practices, through whatever your tactics are, to bring myself back into the minute. Because I'm, like many people, I'm busy, I'm thinking a lot, I'm preparing a lot, I'm rehearsing a lot, I'm creating, I'm always in the future. I don't go back much. I don't reflect too much and get stressed about the past, very rare, but I'm always thinking about the next thing. So, and that's exciting and it's exhausting. But having the strategies to pull yourself back into the moment, back into the now. So, and I think if I was on a desert island, that'd be a desirable thing to do, to appreciate that you're actually in that environment. And I take that as a metaphor. If there was a podcast, I'll throw it in there. Nothing to do with what we do for a living. Everything I think about is to do with what we do. But I would highly, being Welsh, there's a podcast on BBC by Ellis James and John Robbins. That's my podcast of choice. There's some great, it's funny. They've got little made-up games. They've got a Cymru connection, right? It's just good quality chat.
What's it called?
It's Ellis James and John Robbins.
Oh, okay.
It's called Ellis and John. John. It's on Radio 5 on a Friday.
Brilliant.
It's my go-to when I don't want to think about anything else. Just listen to some other people having a chat, that's my go-to podcast. I take one of those.
Well, we will definitely link that for anyone that wants to listen. What about you, Martin?
Mine's a little bit more kind of, I suppose, sort of spiritual in a way, in that, and the reason I picked this particular book, because it had a significant, profound impact on me at the time of reading it. And it is probably it is the only book I've got a collection of 6,000 quid's worth of books. I actually worked that out when I moved here. Because when we moved here, I literally had to build this bookcase around the books. We measured them and extra, so I know how much I spent over many years. Anyway, the one book that I have read now 4 times, and I did make reference to this earlier, is The Power of Kabbalah. And I think because I was brought up in quite a strong Christian family, and I started going to, as past, well, not because I really wanted to go to church, but I was asked to go to church, and really then I sort of had to, and then I decided to. And I carried on going, like most kids, you probably drop out, 12, 13. But I carried on until I was about 16. Now, whether it's because of fear, of thinking if I should, I don't know. But there was always a lot of incongruency about what I read. And I just didn't really, as the more I learned about personal development, I thought I can't buy into all that stuff. It just doesn't quite work out right. When I read The Power of Kabbalah, what it really does, it really talks about science and not religion in the sense of a god, but more in, is there something bigger? So you were referring to earlier. Is there something more than flesh, blood, and tears? Is there something more than this physical body? And so when we look at the science of how we got here, and atom creations and molecules, and what happens to us when we die, and what happens, and I started reading this thinking, wow, yeah, all the atoms that were ever in the world are still in the world. There's a bit of Leonardo da Vinci floating around, and Einstein still playing. You can't get rid of an atom. That quantum physics kind of thinking is, I think, the most groundbreaking thinking. It's the hardest to get your head around, and it really is. And it's like, that's why I kept reading it. But every time I got into trouble or I had issues in my life, I'd read the book, and it would just make me feel good.
Yeah.
It gave me a new insight. Then I went to Kabbalah classes, and I started reading more and more and more and more. And I actually think, I really do believe this. I think if there is one trend in development, it's going to be in spiritual development. We're not there yet. To go into an organization and say, let's do a class in spiritual development, people immediately think religion. And that is a barrier to understanding more than the physical world.
Yeah.
Something that connects me to something more than flesh and blood is, I think, is incredibly inspiring. And we talk about that word enlightenment, don't we? And we might talk about it loosely, but when you get these enlightened moments, you are feeling something more than you actually are. And without putting any substances in my body to get that feeling, that's a different story. But can you get that connection with something more than you actually are? And I do believe that we're going to discover more. And just the same way we've been talking in this podcast about mindset 30 years ago, I think in 10 years' time, we'll be looking back and saying, do you remember a time when we never, ever talked about anything to do with spirituality?
That's what I was going to say. Maybe that's the next wave that will slowly become more talked about, more acceptable and more ingrained in the work that we do. So, I mean, I have to say,
Jim, who was going to say? I think Jim was going to say something.
Oh, sorry.
You brought it up, and it may be for a different podcast, but there's some really fascinating work around psychedelics. And I'm not pitching psychedelics, but I'm talking medical grade in controlled studies. Let's put it like that. I read a great book called The Spirit Molecule about DMT, which is already in our pineal gland. It's in the brain, but it's fascinating as a conduit towards something else that's indescribable, right? That who knows what that means, but I think that's something that's I'm certainly curious and fascinated by, because it's the unknown, and it is known. It's an experience that can be had. Again, I'm talking medical grade in controlled states, legally, is what I'm saying.
All right, we'll let you have that.
A chat for a different day.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, I mean, I was just going to say, I think this has been one of my most favourite podcast episodes to record. I have found out things that I had previously not discovered. I want to know if you've still got the Elvis.
I still got it.
Oh,
Excellent. If I thought I was going to tell that story, I'd have got it ready.
Yeah. But, I just think there's been so much in here that will be of interest to our listeners. And, you know, if there is anything that you want to find out more about, then do get in touch with us and do share this episode with other people. And Jim, Martin, thank you for being so open and so honest and sharing such amazing stories.
And look, if you want to, Jim, I'd highly recommend Jim as a fantastic keynote speaker, big conferences. Your website is
hplab.co.uk.
Yeah, check him out there. And come and talk to us. We're here to help. That's what we love to do.
And here's to the next 30 years.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us, Jim. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.